Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the future perfect tense and kind of unpack how we can form it in the passive voice. So this is our last video we're going to be doing on passive voice. We've done all the other tenses so far, so a lot of this will be repeating itself, but it's important just to make sure that you really understand the basics of what voice is and what we mean by this active, passive, so you can understand how to do this. So the first thing we want to really make sure that we have under control is what is voice, right? What do we mean by this? So you've probably seen this slide before if you've been watching my videos, but there's a difference between what we call active voice and passive voice in Latin and in English. So it's the difference between saying something like, I am walking the dog, and the dog is being walked by me. And I always say this, but a lot of my students will say, hey, doesn't that mean the same thing, Mr. Shi? And I get your point. Technically, it kind of has the same meaning in general, but it's not the same thing. So there is a difference between saying, I'm walking the dog, and the dog is being walked by me. I understand they both have the visual of a dog, right? So if you hear these lines, you're probably thinking, of a dog walking down the street. I get that, but the meaning is slightly different. And that difference in meaning is the difference between active and passive voice. So active voice is when the subject is doing something. We've seen this example before. You say, I am walking the dog. I is the subject. Walking is the verb, right? I walk or I am walking. I'm actually doing that action. That's different than saying the dog is being walked by me. I know in general it kind of means the same thing, but literally it's not operating in the same way. The dog is the subject. My verb is being walked, right? So the subject is not doing anything. When you say the dog is being walked, that's not the same thing as saying the dog is walking, right? Someone is walking the dog. In other words, something's happening to it. That's what we mean by passive voice. It's when the subject is receiving the action, not doing anything. And a lot of times with passive voice verbs, you're going to see the ablative case, right? In this example, you have the ablative of agent when you say by me, but we use the ablative case to say who's actually doing the action. So hopefully this makes some sense. And like I said, if you've been watching my videos, this might be, the second, third, or maybe even sixth time that you've seen these examples, but it should sink in at some point and help you really understand what we're doing with passive voice, because it is much more prevalent in Latin than in English, right? I feel like in a lot of English classes, we tell you not to use passive voice. There's nothing wrong with using it. I think you should, but I know we kind of minimized its use in English, but in Latin, it shows up all the time. So now that we have the basics of voice, active and passive, we have to understand, what does it look like in Latin, right? And I've told you this before, it really depends on the tense that you're using. So we've seen, the present, the imperfect, and the future tenses. They use one process, which is basically the exact same thing for active and passive voice. You're just changing the endings. For future perfect, though, it's following the second pattern that we've seen with perfect and pluperfect passive, where you're doing something different. So in other words, the way you form future perfect active is different than future perfect passive. So you got to kind of keep those two things straight. So that being said, what do we do, right? What is the process? Well, here it is. And again, this should look familiar. You go to the fourth principal part of your verb. That's the exact same starting point as perfect passive and pluperfect passive. But now we have to add on the verb esse, which again, that's something we've done with perfect and pluperfect passive, but the tense of esse is what has made them different. So for future perfect tense, it's the future tense form of esse. And again, that should sound really familiar because we've seen this. If you have the fourth principal part in the present tense of esse, that's perfect passive. Fourth principal part and imperfect tense of esse is pluperfect passive. And the fourth principal part going with the future tense of esse, which we're seeing right now, is future perfect passive. So they're all basically following the same formula, but the difference is in the tense of esse going with that fourth principal part, right? So I know that's a lot of tense talk and it can feel a little overwhelming. The best way to do this is practice it and see it in context. There is a catch, though, that we've mentioned before, and the catch is the fourth principal part. Now, since this is the participle form of the verb, meaning it's basically a verbal adjective, right? It's a first and second declension adjective in terms of its ending. So it has us, endings. Since it's using these adjective endings, it means it has gender and number. The case part doesn't really matter here because it's going to be nominative, right? It's the subject of the sentence, or it's matching the subject of the sentence. So you don't really have to worry about case. But gender and number is really important. So in other words, the way we spell the fourth principal part and the ending we use depends on the gender and the number of your subject. We've said that before, and you're going to see it here again. So here's the example I've been using in all these videos: the verb portare, which means to carry. So when you're dealing with future perfect tense, right? Same with perfect or pluperfect tense. When it's passive voice, you start with that fourth principal part, portatus. So you bring it down, and it's portatus aum. And again, the us aum is showing you the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. They're all singular for the first three, and they're plural for the last three. So when we use the plural forms of this verb, right? We, you, all, and they, it's going to be portati, I, and a, which are the nominative plural forms of masculine, feminine, and neuter first and second declension adjectives. So in red, you can see here, I've put the future tense form of esse. So we have ero, eris, erit, and down the line. When you do that, the fourth principal part, plus the future of esse, you're doing future perfect passive voice. And you can see it in the translation. The way we translate it is, it's not I have been carried or I had been carried. It's I will have been carried. The will have part should sound very familiar to you. That's what we use for future perfect, right? Will have something. So here we're just saying will have been, right? It means it's going to happen in the future. Remember, future perfect tense is used when you're talking about an action in the future that's going to happen before another action in the future. Okay, and this just happens to be the passive voice version of it. So I've shown you this before as well, but the ending is important, right? The gender. So particularly when you're using the first person singular I, the way you spell it depends on your subject. So if you said portata ero, I will have been carried, the A on portata is telling you that your subject is feminine. The same way if you make it portatus ero, you're saying that it's masculine, right? The I, in English, you can't tell. You're saying I will have been carried. The gender doesn't show up. But in Latin, that gender does show up. Based on the ending of the fourth principal part. So this is why I'm telling you the gender is important. It can tell you something about your subject. Same thing happens when you're dealing with third person, right? When you're trying to say they. So the way you say they will have been carried, right? It depends on the gender. You need to know who the they are or who the they is, I guess, however you say that, right? So if you said feminae portata erunt, they will have been carried. I know it's feminae, right? The women will have been carried. So that's why it's portati matching feminae. The same way if it was men being carried, it would be portati matching weary, right? So this is all a way to say that you need to pay attention to that fourth principal part. It's giving you a lot of information. The gender and number are important, right? So if you're forming the future perfect passive, pay attention to the gender and number. If you're translating it, it's telling you the gender and the number of your subject, right? It'll just help you out. So hopefully that makes some sense and you're not feeling too overwhelmed. But like I said, the best way to do this is to practice with some examples, right? See it in context, look at some Latin, and you'll be able to catch this pretty quickly. So here's the first example. And again, these come from the Road to Latin textbook that I use in my class, but you can find these, anywhere. It's not too hard to find. But this is part of a sentence from one of the stories. You have si nos Trojani in urbem tuam bene accepti eremus, ... So it starts by saying if, right? And it's saying if we, nos is your subject, if we will have been welcomed, accepti eremus. So the eremus is future. Accepti is a fourth principal part, the verb to welcome, right? Accept, we will have been accepted. It's kind of one way to do it. So I know this is future perfect passive. The other interesting thing about this, right, is that it's modifying Trojani. If we Trojans will have been, welcomed into the city, right? This is a quote from Aeneas, I think, is saying this. But we know, even if I didn't have the word Trojani, I would know that my subject is a bunch of men, right? Because I'm using a masculine ending with accepti. But here, accepti is modifying Trojani or nos Trojani, right? We Trojans, the Trojans will be accepted, okay? So that's, again, the accepti eremus is future perfect. Here's another one. You have si auxilium ad socios meos misum erit. Misum, fourth principal part, the verb to send. Erit is future tense of esse, right? So you're saying if help will have been sent, the subject is auxilium. Since auxilium is neuter and it's singular, we're using the neuter singular form on misum, the um ending, right? So if help will have been sent to my allies, ... Again, future perfect, right? Future perfect passive, I should say. And here's the last one. We have si pulchra Lavinia ab Ainea visa erit, ... right? And you're saying if beautiful Lavinia will have been seen, visa erit. Again, the erit is future tense of esse. It's going with the fourth principal part, visa, the verb videre, to see. You're saying if Lavinia will have been seen, and then we have the ablative. Remember, we see that a lot with passive voice verbs by Aeneas. But here, the visa is modifying Lavinia, right? That's why it's feminine and singular. So it just kind of helps you translate and put all these pieces together. So now that we've seen it in context, hopefully this has made some sense. Honestly, the future perfect is not a tense you see very often. So this isn't something you should really stress out about. I feel like we use it more in textbooks than you really see in actual Latin. But either way, once you get used to it, it's really not that bad. Even in passive voice, it's not particularly difficult to do, and it works especially if you're taking it, all at the same time with perfect passive and pluperfect passive, because they're all following that same pattern. So it's sort of like once you understand how one works, it's pretty easy to form the others, and then it's just a matter of remembering how to translate it. But if you want practice on it, again, the best tip I can give you is go to Magistrula. If you go to Magistrula, you can use the charts button here under activities. You can set it up to give you all the verbs you can handle, putting them in future perfect passive, right? And you can just practice this over and over and over again until you feel really confident with how to conjugate these verbs. And write them in English, right? Write their translation. That's always a good first step. I think more importantly is practicing your translation on it. So the other thing you should be doing is using the sentences feature on Magistrula, and you can set it up to give you sentences that are primarily using future perfect passive, right? So if you do enough of those, it's better to see it in context. That's always my thought. You can disagree. I think it'll just help you the best, but that will give you as many sentences as you want, just getting mass repetition over and over and over again on sentences using future perfect passive. So between those two things, you should get all the practice you need, and you'll be ready to translate anything you might run into in class, or if you're reading real Latin, whatever it is, you should be totally fine. But again, the more you can read it in context, the better off you're going to be. So let's recap this video. You have future perfect tense passive voice. Remember the passive voice, we've been saying in all these videos on passive voice, the subject is receiving the action. It's not doing anything. That's what makes it passive. For future perfect passive, we translate it as will have been blanked, right? So the blanked part is whatever the sort of simple past tense form of your verb is, and you put will have been in front of it. The will have been is what makes it future perfect passive, okay? To form the future tense, the future perfect tense, passive voice, you take the fourth principal part and you add essay to it, right? So fourth principal part plus the future form of essay is future perfect passive. And you want to pay attention. The gender and number of that fourth principal part is really important. You want to remember that it has to match your subject. So whatever the gender and number of your subject is, that's the ending you use for the fourth principal part, because it's a participle using adjective endings. Hopefully this made some sense. If there's anything you're confused on or anything you want explained a little bit better, feel free to put it in the comments below. I'd be happy to help you. But otherwise, do your best to learn this form, right? Future perfect passive voice. Magistrula will really help you. But your best bet is to read. So whatever textbook you're using or whatever Latin you're reading, just read it over and over again. And the more practice you get with future perfect passive, the easier it'll be. Good luck.